Hello, and welcome to the Alliance Wealth Advisor podcast. I'm your host, Mike Cadaro. For episode 11, I was joined by my colleague Chris Ross and Stephanie Decker of Lackawanna College. Stephanie is the Associate Vice President of Social and Economic Impact. Together, they helped me recap the first annual Financial Impact Summit, which we held in the fall of 2022. Now, this format's a little bit different in that we have sound bites from our speakers that evening, including Maggie Mineo Zayac, John Basaliga, Dr. Jill Murray, and attorney Scott Lynett. Each speaker shared incredible insights and personal stories that benefited everyone who attended. Chris, Stephanie, and I then expand on some of these topics for those who couldn't attend. Our hope, though, is that this conversation will also add some fresh perspective to those who were in the room that evening. With so many great speakers, the event was packed with interesting conversations and useful information. Frankly, it wasn't easy to narrow down what to include in this podcast, but we did the best we could. Some of the topics we explore include value of schools and families teaching young people the foundations of personal finance more effectively, the importance of knowing how our experiences early on in life often shape our financial decisions. We also explored how people in the later stages of life have their own set of challenges, particularly those involved in family-owned businesses. Finally, we talked about how financial education has not been the focus for school systems or universities. While it's important to improve financial education, another thing that became clear was how talking about money at the kitchen table is just as important as improving it in the classroom. Now, as we look ahead to growing the event in 2023, we would love to hear from the business and education leaders in our region who would like to make this better. If you have any ideas on how we can improve the event, or you have any interest in participating, we would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy this episode. All right, so we have two special guests for episode 11 here, where we are going to recap the Financial Impact Summit, which we had in partnership with Lackawanna College back in November. So first, I will introduce my colleague, Chris Ross. For those of you who don't know Chris started his career at Morgan Stanley. He also spent time at Wells Fargo and has been in the financial industry for almost 20 years now. He is one of the founders of Alliance Wealth Advisors, and he currently serves as our managing partner. And, Chris and I have had a lot of conversations, about this event, about things that are important to us in building this firm. And frankly, is the major reason why I made the move to Alliance a couple of years ago. So, Chris, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's just so different to be in the room and just hearing things from, your perspective over the last, 10 episodes, I think that you had. This is episode 11.
Yep.
Thank you for having me.
So, Chris, where I wanted to start with you maybe very quickly and before we introduce Stephanie is just from your perspective, what this event means to the firm and frankly, what it even means for you personally, because, you've had your fingerprints on this as really since the beginning. I think all three of us have, frankly.
Yeah, for sure. It's different from my perspective. We have a team of multi-generational advisors, right? So we're able to work with grandparents, we're able to work with parents, and even in young adults. And, when you're working through that, conversations that we had with grandparents, are a little bit different, right? They're focused on, their legacy and their family's well-being. They're focused, really on that next generation. And then the first few conversations we have with young professionals, it really is driven with headlines and media. Mm-hmm. Right. And, what's trending on Twitter. Wow. Right. So we have this, and I think, Mike, this is what you, in your op-ed with Dr. Murray, you talked about this. Pennsylvania, I think they were rated C. They were graded C for financial education or teaching financial education in Pennsylvania. Then I think you look at, the situation where, I don't know, most parents, do they have enough resources at home to have these conversations about money?
Yeah.
So we're in a situation now where, personally, I'm looking at, this multi-generational wealth transfer that's happening currently in the United States. And, is that next generation ready? Is the baby boomer to next gen, is that something that we're talking about? And, why aren't we having these conversations? So I think that's what really spurred the conversations with you and I, and the team, and then we met with, Stephanie and Jill at Lackawanna. And that's really what kicked a lot of this off.
So Stephanie, you currently serve as the AVP of Social and Economic Impact at Lackawanna College. In my time getting to know you, I guess it's been a year or roughly now since I started getting involved with Lackawanna. We met at an event in passing and sort of just went right into, I kind of just gave you my pitch.
Yes, you did.
Ideas I had. So one thing I have learned about you, though, is that
You do that? No.
there is no title that can really sort of capture all you're doing, even just sitting down and catching up briefly here, you're talking about the Blitzen Bar.
Right.
You were a driving force behind that. So what I would love to hear and have listeners hear is sort of your role as it is today, as you see it, and the path that led there. And then we can get into some of the things that Chris mentioned, which I know you have a lot of thoughts on too.
Great. Well, let me start by summarizing how I see myself, and then I'll kind of define my job if I can do that. So,
Great.
Born and raised in Scranton, went away for college, but then came home, and I've always loved this city and I've always loved this region. And I always thought, why can't we do better? Why can't we live better lives? Why can't we have all the cool amenities and arts and culture offerings that other cities have? Not huge cities, just other cities of our size. And so I've always had a great love for the region and wanted great things for it and our people. And I think that is a really good way to segue into what I do now. So AVP of Social and Economic Impact means that I get to think about ways every day to help our cities and our citizens live better stories. So what I think about is pretty much through three pillars: connecting people through entrepreneurial opportunities. We have a business incubator at Lackawanna College, so that's one of the things that I'm really involved with. So our students, our employees, members of the community, learning how to be an entrepreneur, helping with business development plans, things like that. Through educational opportunities, so we're always looking at workforce needs, creating new programs, making sure that we're training for the right jobs and we're training those students well. And then finally helping our students get connected in the community. So those are the three things that I think about every day: entrepreneurism, education, and community connection in my job.
I think what I love about Lackawanna, the more I get to know the team, the more I sort of get myself immersed, is a lot of what you just touched on, which is first, not being afraid to think big, right? So really getting out of that academic box, which has so many strings attached. But then two, this idea that Scranton has to serve as an engine for the region.
Right.
And how do we kickstart it? And those two things are what I hear anytime I hear you speak, anytime I hear Jill, Erica, the whole team. And I think, one of the things that attracted Alliance to doing this along with you was my experience in hearing that, but frankly, in seeing it.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
So, one thing I'd like to speak on a little bit before getting into some of the recap itself, is maybe the event from your perspective. So, I had conversations with Alicia Burns in the business department. I think I was throwing a lot of stuff at a lot of people, and you came in to sort of help refine it. So I'd love to hear your perspective on sort of how it grew, and then what you thought of the event, now that it's come to pass for the first time.
So I was really excited. You and I both kind of geek out over personal finance, and I think that's why your business pitch landed so well with me in the first 2 minutes I met you. I started my career as a chef, worked in that industry for a long time, started at Lackawanna, building our school of hospitality. But then when I decided to go back to school, I ended up really loving finance. I just took a class, getting my MBA, and then I left, I switched to a concentration in finance. One of my favorite quotes of 2022 is, "You are best positioned to help the person you once were." And I really didn't know that much about finance. We didn't talk about it, so when I was growing up. So I really loved that and felt empowered by having that knowledge. So when you were talking about doing something that could make finance just more accessible, kind of demystify it, I was so in on being part of that opportunity and having Lackawanna College partner with you. And that I think when at the event itself, I came with the idea that Jill and I were coming from the academia side of things, that would be the role we served. And I just sat back and listened because there was nothing academic about what Jill and I said. What we heard is that people aren't having conversations. There's fear about talking about it. Yeah. And so I just from hearing all the panelists, each and every one of them talk about they wish they knew more earlier, that really marked me. And I thought, wow, this is our job. This is what we're called to do now to start getting the conversation going. Yeah. And you actually highlighted something for Chris and I when we played it back. And that was this idea of, so I've been focused on the classroom, and Chris and I spend so much time with our team putting together, whether it's visual slides to help people understand it, what we're trying to do better, really walking them through, what you own, why you own it, and focusing on that education piece and kind of with a classroom tilt. But what we realized, which you just sort of alluded to, Chris, and it kind of hit us in the face, we missed it, was this idea of it's not happening in the classroom. That's a problem. We need to address it. But it's not happening at the kitchen table either. Yeah. So where is it happening? And that's a void, and it leads to mistakes, because I think the number one thing that I hear, and I'm sure you do too, Chris, when we're speaking with a client, somebody who may be a new client or is interested in being a client, it's, well, I just so you know, I don't know anything at all. I don't know anything at all, and there's this almost defensive posture because they haven't had exposure to it, right?
Yep, I agree. I think it's one of the, we have a situation where, a lot of it comes down to not making that big mistake. People take it too far. I mean, I think as you hear some of the panelists talk about keeping it simple, right? And just understanding doing these small things could end up in, having major and large results, and not making that big mistake is important. So if you're not learning it in the classroom, and if you're not learning it at home, I think the opportunity to make that large mistake early on is something that we want to address. Well,
and it just leads to this sense of dread or anxiety when it comes to money, right? All right, well, I'm just going to put my head in the sand, right? It's like the ostrich approach. I'm going to put my head in the sand and just focus on what I do know, right? My family, my job, and then just hope that this other stuff works out. Is that something you would have experienced or seen from people? Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I agree with what you both had as a takeaway, Chris and Mike. And Jill Murray, our president, said something that when I was playing it back, because, when you're sort of in it, you miss things. And when I played it back and was listening to it again, Jill said that, higher ed makes the assumption that people are talking about finance with their family. And then she said their peers. And that, I wrote it down and I was like, are our friends talking about this? Are people mentoring each other in personal finance? And I don't think so. No. And if we have time, I could share this one story. When I finally did start getting my financial act together, and it took me a long time, and started studying finance in college, I noticed a friend of mine, my best friend's husband, who was really good at personal finance. And I would just pick up on little things, and then I would start asking questions because I just wanted to be a student of, how did you do this? You maxed out your children's 529? Right? Because what you're saying is true. We think I'll get the money when the time comes, but right now they're little. We have too many bills. It's just, I can't get to it right now. Yep. Right. And then he was talking about that they paid off their mortgage before the 30-year term. And the people in my life I had watched refinancing to pay off things like credit card debt, right? Mm-hmm. Constantly that cycle. And so when I started having conversations with him, a peer, I thought, wow, I wish this happened earlier in my life. Where was the book on this?
Right.
Well, so to both of those points, we do have a clip, and we're going to go in and out of some clips as we go along here, because I do think it's useful for listeners who obviously weren't there. Right? It was certainly well attended, and we were excited about that. But we want to have this to go back to. So the first quote is something that Maggie Zayac said. So Maggie's the owner of the Daisy Collective, and she talked a lot about how she wishes. I asked her, how did she make those big decisions? And she had a fantastic answer, which was, well, it starts with the small ones. And she's 100% right. So let's start with that. And then the three of us can talk about it on the other side.
My family, we didn't really talk about finances. We didn't really talk about money. That was not something that my parents stressed or stressed about. We were busy being kids. My parents kept all of that behind the scenes. And now being a parent, I understand why they did that. But also looking back, I wish we had some of those conversations, stress the importance about, you're asking, how did I make those big financial decisions? Well, it starts with the little ones. I wish I knew how important, paying your car payment on time, your student loans, paying your credit card, all of those little decisions that you make impact the big financial decisions that you have to make, either good or bad. Teaching young kids, and I don't know if that's high school, college, just the importance of the smaller financial decisions and how those decisions will impact you in your career later on.
I think the one thing that sticks out when I listen to that is one thing we talk a lot about, which is, we don't sell products, right? We want to have an ongoing process where the little things continually get taken care of in an incremental way. And that makes all the difference when it comes to those big moments in life, right? I mean, we're always talking about life events, but if you wait for the big life event to pull the trigger on some of this stuff, you're going to be behind the 8 ball. Yeah.
In Maggie's situation, she's an entrepreneur. She has a creative mindset. So it's okay not to know everything about finance too. So I think I want to make sure, we get that point across where you don't have to become an expert. I think you have to surround yourself with the right team. And I think you have to know, where those resources are, when those important decisions need to be made. I want to share a quick story. When we talked about this, we listened to the same types of other podcasts and interviews. And the actress, Reese Witherspoon, she recently sold her company. I forget the name of the company. It's a media company for $900 million. Right. And, when she's going through this,
I wonder if she needs a financial advisor.
Yeah. Well, she's going through this. She's in a big, large boardroom, right? With a lot of people talking about this deal, and they're talking about, ROI, right? They're using terms on how to raise capital. And she stopped and she's telling the story in the interview. And she says, I don't really know what those words mean. Right. And here's someone who is very successful, has built an empire, sold for almost $1 billion. And she doesn't know these simple terms. So it's okay not to know everything. But she had a team around her who did. Yeah. Right. And that was important. She led the creative part of that business. And she surrounded the team with a team to help make those decisions. And I think that's what my takeaway from the event is. The audience that was there. I mean, it wasn't just, college students. I mean, there was a very diverse audience. And I think one of the things I wanted to highlight with this event is we had an opportunity to share those resources with the community because they were right there. Right. And I think that's one of the initiatives that we wanted to bring to the Financial Impact Summit is making sure we're connecting business owners with those resources.
Yeah.
So, that was my takeaway.
What did you think about what Maggie said there?
I thought it was just so simple but genius. She was surrounded by entrepreneurs, so maybe always thought she could someday, although I think I was surprised to learn she was a journalism major first. I always just think of her as this great entrepreneur. But it is the little things. And it was really poignant that her dad was in the audience and they were both being vulnerable, because I think that's magical, because then we can all learn from that, right? Like she was saying, like they just let them be kids and not worry about the financial stuff. But then they had a sticky relationship moment when who's paying these student loans, and they were both pointing at the other person, right? So I think that what she was teaching us all is it's okay to talk to your kids about things like that, right? Like, people say, oh, don't ever in marriage fight in front of your kids. No, if you show them how to do conflict well and with respect, then that's okay that they see disagreements get resolved. And I think it's okay that kids also get a glimpse into family economics, you know, and how to do things well. And those were the kind of little things she was talking about. Like, you always make sure that you make your car payment and your mortgage payment, because those, have a greater impact on a credit score. And so she was really just talking about foundational things that can start as conversations around the kitchen table.
And everything compounds, right? Every decision compounds. And when you ignore things, that compounds. Sure. And that probably compounds faster. So, are we addressing these things, or are we letting them build? And, which side of the compounding
are we on?
Balance sheet are you on is something that people should pay a little more attention to it. So there's a second clip along these lines. So I'll just go right into it. And this is where John Basiliga talks about his own personal start, and it's very different from Maggie's, but I loved it, and it touches on the same things, I think, in his own way. So let's go into this clip with John, and build on this idea of sort of taking these fundamentals and not taking the big picture all at once all the time.
So John, going to you, similar question. What was your start? How did you make these decisions based on how you were brought up, which was obviously different from Maggie? And then let's start there, and then I do have a follow-up question for you.
Yeah, I think, Mike, when I got started, I kind of looked at my finances at the time, looked at my expenses, and I got to a point where it was my bare minimum needed to get into business. I think anybody thinking about it already has what it takes to do that. Mine was, I had a truck payment, I was paying rent on a house, and some food, which was probably the last thing on my list. And at the point I was in a roofing business, I got in when I was 20 years old, and I said if I could do one residential job every 2 weeks, I could just survive, but barely, but it was enough. And once I put that into perspective, and nothing else really scared me, I simplified it to look at it that way. I think people just think too much at first. They think of all the bad things that could happen. I in really simplistic terms, I said, this is all I need to do to get by. If I can make that happen, I'm good. I'll get to the next job. I'll survive 2 weeks at a time. And it worked for me.
So that'll be the understatement of the night.
I didn't have...
So there, and it was funny because it was so simple. He was done, and I should have just jumped in, and I didn't. But I think, just breaking it down, and I've heard you say this when you've spoken before, this idea of you need to strip the limiting thoughts out before you can move forward. Yeah. And I think in a lot of ways, that's kind of what he's saying, right?
Yeah, I agree. I was just taken aback by how simple he put it, and how we can kind of take that example that he gave of just, okay, if I could do this many jobs, I can pay my bills. And sometimes I think that's how we should look at budgets, right? Like, okay, what are my bills? How much do I need to make? Am I making enough, or do I need to, get more income in here? And like you said, things compound. If you're spending more, John alluded to that a little later in our session, you don't spend more than you make. And that's so foundational, but how many of us have done that, right? Yeah. And then that compounds into debt and stress.
One thing we always try to focus on, right? Like even in our writing, right? In our research, in our marketing materials is like simplicity, right? And that doesn't mean it's easy, right? In fact, simplicity is harder, right? But if you meet complexity with complexity, you're just making a mess, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. So what did you think about what John said, Chris?
Well, the simplicity is key. And, you don't need 2 million. I think he connected with the audience. You don't need 200 square feet of real estate to be successful. And I think he he showed the audience, how he started in breaking that down. So, I agree with Stephanie and just that point. Looking back at the audience, I was on the other side looking. You guys were up on the panel, but he did connect with the audience when he said that, and I think people were curious. And again, sometimes keeping it simple is the easiest thing, or not the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I tied it to when it comes to this financial planning conversation, right, is like I'm always saying, all right, let's just focus on 90-day sprints. Right? If we do the best we can in the next 90 days, what can we control in the next 90 days? And if we do that for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you're going to build wealth, right? But if you're trying to plan for retirement at 30 and you're looking out at, I want a lake house and I want, I'm going to have this many kids and you're going to give yourself a panic attack. So let's just break it down, right? Like how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And that's really all he was saying. He had to go 2 weeks at a time for a while.
Yeah, you're quoting Jill Murray, too, our president. She tells us all the time, we have huge dreams. You and I were just talking about the things that we've been able to accomplish at Lackawanna, and she just says, chunk it out. Just chunk it out. And that's how we do it.
So this part of the conversation that I want to hit on next is where a lot of the first part of the entire night was, which is behavioral finance, right? And really all that means, again, let's make it simple. It's just we are a product of our environments growing up and those who raised us and taught us about money. So those early experiences, like they really, really drive us. And a lot of times I don't think you even know. It's kind of this operating system that goes on in the background and it's driving your decisions without you knowing. So this behavioral finance piece, I think Maggie and John both kind of hit on, maybe without even knowing it. So we'll talk about Maggie's piece first, and then we'll listen to John as well.
So I come from a family of entrepreneurs. Both of my grandparents owned their own businesses. My dad ended up owning his own business. Then I did. My mom, my brother. It's in our blood, I like to say.
Which helps.
It totally helps. So I always had, I would say, the confidence and the support around me to, kind of do my own thing, start my own business. But everything else that went into it, it was a lot. It was overwhelming. And at times I really didn't know who to go to for those important questions. All I knew was the work ethic and the hard work that went into owning your own business.
So Chris, you did kind of hit on this already to some degree in terms of knowing what you don't know and then building the team for your blind spots. And that's something I think we have done very well, as a team at Alliance, which is like, I'm just not good at X. So if he is or she is, then let them do it and be willing to let go. Right. And I think Maggie speaks to that. But the other thing is like, growing up thinking entrepreneurship is normal, like that's a strategic advantage because it's not, right?
Yeah, controlled chaos sometimes, and just understanding going through your workday and wearing 4 or 5 different hats, right? And so I think the importance of building that team around you is extremely important. And I think that was one of the initiatives, for us to kickstart an event like this. So you could get introduced to people, especially on the panel, to Lackawanna, the community. Our region sometimes gets a bad rap, of just being in Scranton, Pennsylvania. But if you look under the hood and you see a lot of that stuff, going on behind the scenes, it's pretty impressive. So when you talk about building a team, some people think that you have to go out of town, and that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of that stuff just in this area. And that's one of the things that we try to highlight.
Yeah, I think you saw it in terms of just who was in the room that night, right?
Totally.
So let's talk about John's piece. And Steph, I'd love to hear your take on this once we wrap it up, because where Maggie's saying, look, we had business owners, in every generation, and I knew it was going to be successful. Like that is so infectious, right? And what was interesting is John, right on the other side of this, is giving a completely different take, based on his experience growing up as a kid. So let's listen to that, and I'd love to hear your take.
And I think, going back to the first part, right, with sort of how we make decisions based on how we grew up, you've mentioned how that experience with your father and Sugarman's, that shaped you and that drove you in many ways. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, definitely, Mike. I saw my father, one thing, I love my father to death. He died in 2010. I would never disrespect him, but after he had that tough time, he never really got back up on his feet. And that was something that always stuck with me. And basically for me, I just said, I never want to be like that. I never want to be in that position, struggling all the time. And we did. And we had a really, really tough time growing up. And, that leads to, money problems lead to fighting and all that other stuff. And it was unfortunate.
Yeah.
You could, speaking of that vulnerability, right? Like for him to come out in a room with 100 people in it and tell this story and really speak to that, that experience of bankruptcy and closing up a business and how much it drove him and shaped him, I think is pretty incredible. And was something where, you could hear a pin drop when he told that story. So what was your takeaway? And I think why I ask you first, Steph, is with the students, oftentimes, you're dealing with at Lackawanna, they've had hard experiences that have shaped them, and it's not easy to break that, right?
No, it's not. And that was a really poignant moment in our summit. And I think, Mike, you started by talking about behavior, right? And finance is so much behavior. And when John said that, what came to mind with me is I thought, I wonder if he had people in his life, his dad, that he said he never really rebounded. And that really affected John and drove him to not repeat those things, right? So as human beings, we're, our behaviors are contagious socially, right? There's all these studies that if you hang out with friends that have successful relationships and marriages, yours have. Divorce is contagious, right? Finance is contagious. There's studies that say that your friend group will determine your income level. You'll start making more or less depending on, the people that you surround yourself with. And so I was starting to think about that, we talked about conversations so important to personal finance. And then I thought when he said this, it just made me stop. And he didn't tell us this, but I wondered, connections are important too. The people that we're connected with to get us through those hard times are a big part of our success or failure. Yeah,
it's like that. You're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with, right? That probably is true. And it's funny that some of the science and the studies behind it kind of back up these things that are almost cliche.
I think, Mike, you have a lot of research and, you've written a lot of articles, regarding your past and your experiences and, talking about the markets, right? Talking about, I think Scott Lynett down, talks about how his dad viewed banks, right? What's your, you have a lot of research in that, what was your take on it?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So prior to Alliance, right, I was working at this firm in Philly, Brown Brothers Harriman, and, these are some of the most successful people, quote unquote, on the planet in dollar terms. However, a lot of them are driven by these little childhood things that were big sort of outliers, right? So a lot of, depression babies where, they were not going to raise kids in the environment they were raised in. And certainly in my own experience, I always try to bring that psychology piece to any fundamental financial analysis we're doing, because you can't separate the two, right? And we're going to be rational long-term, and like everybody says that, right? But if you don't know what's driving your impulses and your decision making, you can't be mostly rational. And frankly, often people, markets and which are made up of millions of people, they're not rational. And that's because people aren't, right?
Right.
So that was, I think, a really interesting part of the discussion. I want to shift gears a little bit. You alluded to Scott. So let's just go there now, because this was fantastic. And this one's a little longer, but it's really important, because here's the thing. We can talk about education. We can talk about having these conversations at the dinner table and all of these things. And that's great. But most people, school's out. Right. And the older we get, the more we become sort of hardened into who we are. And you're not going to have this conversation with a 75-year-old who's done it. They don't want to listen to me telling them, well, if you think about your feelings, So let's talk about let's listen to Scott's, and then we'll talk about that, because it is really important, and it's something that I think a lot of us struggle with when it comes to family, and certainly in the intersection of business and family.
So Scott, I want to move to you because I think we talked about this early stage decision making, into growth mode, believing in yourself, making sure that you're willing to just take the action and not just overanalyzing things. But where you're living and spending a lot of your time is kind of on the other end. So people who have built that business, they have built that nest egg, and now it's still complicated, right? Because now we're not talking about how we're going to maybe leave money to our family or where we want our charitable causes to be. And so again, this theme of emotions and money being complex, it leads to mistakes, right? And then there's a lot of people too, we see it all the time, where you move the goalposts. So when I have a certain amount of money, then I'll be happy, right? When I get to retire, then I'll be happy. And then they don't spend that money they worked so hard for, and they don't get to enjoy it. So can you speak to your experience, at this latter stage, and what are the mistakes people make? And school's been out at that point, right? So the education system can only do so much. So how can we help people make better decisions at that stage?
It's a great question, Mike. I'll be brief, John.
You're fired, right?
But I think if you look, billionaires make mistakes. The Forbes 400 list with Elon Musk is currently topping, and he's in the middle of making a big mistake, I think, as we speak. But if you look historically on that list, 3 years from now, 25% of the people on that list will be gone. 12 years from now, 60% of the people on that list will be gone. Bad financial decisions are not limited to the early part of careers. People continue those biases that Chris talks about. They haunt everyone through their entire lives. I grew up in a house with my grandfather who grew up in the Depression. He never trusted banks. There was always cash hidden everywhere. And that, to me, that was totally irrational. But based on his life experience, that was a completely rational thing for him to do. And those are the sort of things people carry on. Maggie, your comment, I think one of the big challenges is money is a taboo subject in so many households. Parents are so uncomfortable talking to their children about money. And
in my house, we only talked about politics.
Right, yeah, right, exactly. Something non-controversial. So that becomes a real challenge. And when you talk about goals, figuring out what your goals are and what's meaningful to you is really important. I worked with a family at one point. They had a great business, $50 million business. They're doing terrific, and they got in their heads they wanted to be $100 million. They wanted to get there. And they got there, but they did it by piling a ton of debt on their balance sheet, and they were making less money than they ever made, and ultimately got in a lot of trouble. So you really need to sit back and, during this journey, figure out what's really important to you and what are you doing. Sometimes when I'm sitting with my clients, I'll say to them, if we can get a time machine and I could go back and tell you 20 years ago, show you what you built, how would the 30-year-old version of you feel about that? And although they don't feel great in that moment because they kept doing, like you said, they kept moving those benchmarks, they never celebrated the milestones, they'll usually say to me, oh my God, I never imagined it would be this good. I never imagined I'd have this much success. And so sort of reframing that and getting them to see, because moving the goalpost is a disease. I mean, it can really, because you're always driving yourself, and that's what people do. And the issues that I end up dealing with generally with people who are further along, it comes down to three things. It's one, their purpose. Number two, the control. And number three is the money. And honestly, when I'm dealing with business owners, the money ends up being the least important of the three. These owners have been there a long time. They're thinking about maybe leaving their business or transitioning it to other owners. And they're having a really hard time because it's who they are sometimes. They have nowhere to go.
So it's the identity.
It is it has become their identity. And I'll tell my clients, if you don't have anything to retire to, you're not going to go. This is going to end badly because you won't have purpose beyond this amazing thing that you've built, but understand that it's going to end with you.
So that that's pretty heavy stuff. And, all of this is, frankly, but Chris, I'll go to you first on this one, because I think, with you and our partners, Perry and Doug, you've had a lot of these clients, these clients span your career. They span multiple careers, going back to that multi-generational team, right? So you're seeing this as well. What's your experience when it comes to these conversations?
Well, I think there's a lot of more positives. When you're an entrepreneur, there's a lot of drive and there's a lot of involvement. But one of the negatives, I think, is moving that goalpost. And you see that with a lot of business owners, where they have the ability to create and make a difference or change, different things within their business. So when Scott talks about, those different areas, and as you build your career and you build your business, a lot of people, in our experience, they forget to think about that next chapter and what's important. And I think Scott nails it when he talks about that. And, focusing on that transaction, focusing on the liquidity event, but not planning for what you want to do personally. There's a clip, I don't know if we shared it or not, where we talked about, you said identity, right? And sometimes you chimed in, and sometimes a lot of business owners look at their business as their identity. And if they don't have anything after that, money is great, but when that's not there, then that's where some mistakes are made, right? And that regret starts to happen, and then you don't enjoy it, right? And and that's one of the things that Scott really hit on. That is something that we see, with our business owner clients.
Steph, the one thing that jumped out to me, and would love to hear your thoughts on this, is I think there's a perception out there, right? That there's when you go to that wealth inequality conversation, which is a really important loaded conversation, that's its own episode, right?
Right.
However, the perception is that, there is just generational wealth, and there's the haves and have-nots, and it stays the same for all time, right? When really, and this goes something that I saw in my prior life, less than 10% of businesses, family-owned businesses, make it to a third generation. And often that's because of, outright, failure and transition. So what were your thoughts in listening to Scott? And is that something, you can speak to in terms of this idea of, the kind of the mishandling from generation to generation?
Oh, you just asked me two really hard questions. So the first was the haves and have-nots, right? And at Lackawanna College, we serve a population that many of them have a lot of bridges are out for them, right? They're on the socioeconomic continuum. They're starting way behind. So I think what I thought about when you asked me that question is that when we're getting to have conversations, you got to teach a personal finance class, right? I teach a business management class and a restaurant accounting class. So we get to talk about money, and we get to have these sidebar conversations. And I think it's amazing that there is hope, right? For the people that start out without the generational wealth or not the second generation of a family business. They just want to know that there is hope and how. And so I love that you and I get to have those conversations, and we need more of those in the classroom. But the second question you asked me was what happens with the transfer of, there's a saying, right? First generation builds it, and then I don't want to say they're us, but by the third generation, sometimes the business is gone.
Yep.
Right. And I think when Scott told the story about that family that wanted to move the goalpost to be $100 million company at the expense of crippling debt and their balance sheet, that translates to a personal level too. We do that as well. But I think the word that stuck out for me is just contentment. You guys are the financial experts. When people want to have a wealth building plan, they need to connect with experts like you. Like you said, right? You plug your holes, right? They can be good at whatever they do. They need people like you guys to help them with the, finance is a complicated business. That's where you guys come in and play your role. But if you have the behavior of contentment, and saying, hey, this is like Scott said, like if I looked back and told my 20-year-old self what I've built now, what would he or she think? And they'd be pretty proud, as he told us, and I think that contentment is a huge behavior that anyone can do. You guys can help people with the hard stuff. The behavior of finance, being content, not, as John said, spending more than you make, right? Not wanting to grow beyond what is reasonable at this point if it's going to saddle you with debt. That's what jumped off the microphone to me. Yeah,
the line that he had, which he should trademark, like that, the goalpost moving is a disease.
Is a disease.
And we could take that out of finance and just say in life, right? Like if you're doing that, it's not going to work out.
Mm-hmm. Living in an environment where social media is just in your face all the time, and TikTok, Instagram, seeing the keeping up with the Joneses mentality, our parents, and even myself, back in high, we didn't have that to see or to compare. And I think society today is, putting so much pressure on that, and it's just becoming more difficult to address that issue.
I couldn't agree with you more.
I spoke to a group of high school students a while back, and I said, like, all of these filters are making you try to keep up with the Joneses, and none of it's real.
Right.
So think about, like, that's even harder, because we were always trying to keep up with the Joneses, right? I don't care what generation we're talking about, but at least then they were looking across the street.
Yeah.
Now we're looking at
the metaverse.
Yeah.
So the next piece that I want to get to is Jill's, and I think a huge assist from you for really like crystallizing this, I think, for me and the team at Alliance, which is, the classroom's important, as I said, but the conversations at the kitchen table need to happen. They're more important, frankly. And so we need to bring these conversations about money to the forefront and help people have them more productively. And that's something that Jill spoke to.
Jill and Stephanie, just to bring it back now to education. This is a really simple question. Jill, I'll start with you, but the answer is, I'd imagine, more complex than any of us know. But it is straightforward. So, why don't we do a better job of teaching people how to make decisions with their money?
I think the education system in general makes a lot of assumptions about conversations that happen in families and between families and amongst friends. And that's something we should not make an assumption about. Conversations about finance don't happen that often. And so by the time they're starting to transition to college, they're thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to pay for college? I have to get my mom and dad in, or my family in, to help me sign on the dotted line for my student loans, which, by the way, many of you probably do know, that you can take out more than your education costs to live, right? So you can take living expenses out of those federal loans. So students are taking loans to live or subsidize their life and do whatever they're going to be doing with it, and then paying those exorbitant rates when they're done. And the colleges and universities in this country, you may or may not know this, by law, cannot counsel a student to take or not to take those loans. We have very strict limitations on what we can say and can't. And so that presents, challenges for us. And those conversations are very difficult. So by the time they get to us, those kind of peer conversations or family conversations, sometimes a student is sitting down with their parent for the first time, and the parent has to talk about their finances for the first time in front of that student. And so that's really difficult to do. And so we're playing catch up. Colleges and universities are playing catch up.
So Steph, let's start with you here for obvious reasons. But that idea of playing catch up, right? It's like, by that point, if you're getting that piece of paper and you're walking across the stage, right? Like, there's a lot of sunk costs involved.
A lot.
And the magnitude of it as education costs have exploded. The education and the framework to make these decisions hasn't kept up. So things kept getting complex, and we're not even having conversations. Never mind teaching people. We're not even talking about it. So, a lot of people feel this inadequacy. And it really wasn't their fault, because the world just kind of got complicated all around them while they were being told, well, you have to go to college. So how do you think about that as a parent? But then how do you think about it at Lackawanna and where you sit sort of in that education field?
So the parent one is easier. I'm a parent of 4 kids. Most of them are young adults now in their 20s. And we have a 17-year-old who's on his way to being an adult. So I'm just trying to get somebody off the books. But we, not always, but we also, in my house growing up, did not have these conversations. So when I finally woke up as a parent myself, I started talking about it with my kids, really intentionally talking about it and not making a word. Like if we'd be at Target and the kids would want a ton of things and I would say it's not in the budget, they started to view that word with a lot of negativity. But then I would say things like, hey guys, a budget isn't saying no. A budget is like saying not now because we want to go to Disney. And if you look at it that way, like I'm not buying this stupid junk that's going to break in, right? Because I have a goal for
that
this.
You're going to forget about.
Exactly. And so we, as a family, started to view a budget as permission to say yes to the things that were really important to us.
I love that.
So that's how I view it as a parent. And it was a work in progress, right? I made it negative at first. No, it's not in the budget. And then when, the budget was, I'll tell you something very, very personal and that I'm very proud of. When Eddie, my husband, and I wrote the checks for our kids to go to college because we budgeted for that. And then she wrote us a letter, our oldest at the time, and said, I saw when you said no to the stupid stuff that weren't in the budget. And I could cry it's because you wanted to do this for me. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Wow. So that makes budgeting a really positive thing. So if you can do that at the kitchen table and in Target, and it's saying yes to the bigger, more important things. And then, oh man, I got emotional. What was the second half of the question? What do we have to do in the classroom?
Well, I think it's more, I guess the second part of the question, and that is one of the best stories I've heard since we started this podcast, because the self-awareness of your daughter, but also the satisfaction that must bring you as a parent, it truly is awesome. But the second part, I think, is, when you look at the competitive landscape of the education field, right? Lackawanna sits in a unique place where I think, the term we used when Eric and Jill were here was disruptor, because frankly, it's too expensive. And we talk a lot about, as analysts, we talk about price versus value, right? Do those match up? Will they match up now? Or do they match up right now? Will they match up in the future? And if you look at it as an investment, and I'm speaking for myself only here, quite frankly, the answer is no. And so how do you get the price to match the value and frankly exceed it for this next generation of college students who want and need different things than the prior generation?
There's so many common themes here, but we at Lackawanna College, we know that we are about the least expensive private tuition and fees included in the state of Pennsylvania, and that doesn't happen easily. So going back to contentment, being resourceful, being innovative, chunking it out, we have an obligation. If we want to help our students in our community live better stories, then we can't be the convening mechanism that saddles them or allows them to saddle themselves with exorbitant debt. So we work really hard on that. And then we have those conversations in the classroom. We are such a mission-driven organization. None of us work there because we're, getting wildly wealthy on our salaries. You can't be the lowest tuition and do that, right? It just doesn't make sense. But we are so mission-focused that we are constantly thinking of ways like Blitzen, to deliver these exceptional, the value the students got this semester working for a Disney alum, working in the hottest pop-up venue in the city of Scranton. I'd go beyond Scranton. We rivaled any major city. The value that they got in that classroom well exceeded, the cost of the tuition. And we work really hard to keep that as low as we can. We have that obligation to our students.
Yeah. Chris, so I'm going to shift gears on the kind of the same thought to you and your day job and what we do every day, which is kind of this, the individual sort of outcome, right? So we're focused on this process at the individual level, which is different for everybody, right? Based on, where they're at in life and what they've experienced to that point. But when this happens and they're stuck with the debt, they haven't had the conversation, right? How important is it to have a process in place to deal with, kind of all of it, right? That can be overwhelming both to the client and frankly, to their advisors.
Yeah, I think, well, you mentioned before taking, small changes, 90-day sprints you mentioned, but we focus a lot, at Alliance, in our financial planning foundations about taking inventory. You probably hear that too much. We always talk about with our team and our clients. And I think the student debt, when you go through the personal balance sheet, when you first get started and talking about, assets, minus liabilities equals net worth and seeing that chunk on the liability side and, making that decision about debt at a very early age when you haven't had the experience to understand, what ultimately you want to do. The conversation is different. Stephanie, your girls come to our office, and not have that large amount on the liability side. It's a different conversation.
Right.
And I think giving them a competitive edge, in life and be able to pursue things that they want to pursue earlier. It's a big deal. And it's a conversation that, when you're 18 years old and talking to parents that don't have those resources or enough resources, it has a tremendous impact on the balance sheet. And, navigating whether or not to pay for your retirement, to save for college, these aren't easy decisions,
and they're different for everybody. There's no, it's not a one size fits all thing.
You're bringing up a really good point, Chris. And one of the strategies that Eddie and I used that just occurred to me is it took a lot of courage too for us to pay for college because we couldn't afford a lot of, we had a finite amount of income coming in that we could save for our kids' college. And we told them what that pot was, which limited their choices, and you've done a ton of research. I've written so much of what you've read, but tons of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies graduated from state schools. You don't need a designer degree to have a great income. And quite honestly, we couldn't afford that. So it took courage and contentment to say to the kids, we can afford to get you through your bachelor's degree within these boundaries.
Yeah, looking at what Lackawanna is doing and giving them some opportunities, in high school. That was part of your disruptor program, or I forget the name of it.
Level Up.
Level Up program was... Right. Making sure before you commit, to doing this and just having some experience. And, we have, interns that come into our office and some people love it. Some people are like, wow, this is totally different than what I thought it was going to be. And I think those things in the community and offering those opportunities, for someone before they make that large investment, like Mike was saying, I think is important. And that's one of the initiatives that I think Alliance and Lackawanna and the community is trying to create, to make sure they understand, the different avenues that they could pursue before they have to take on that amount of debt.
Yeah. So shifting from these really personalized individual, situations kind of that we're talking about and dealing with every day to, I think, your answer, which I want to play right now, which is, what if we did this at scale? What does that look like? And I think your answer was so good. And a couple of people mentioned this to me that night.
You stopped.
You didn't do any Q. You could have kept going. People were really interested. I was like, her answer was too good. I wasn't going to follow that up. So I wrapped it up. So let's play that now and let's talk about it, because I think, our Center for Investor Education, Lackawanna, at the end of the day, these things are about scaling up these individualized things to have more impact on more people. So let's listen to that right now.
I think Jill's right, and I think this panel, it's interesting that most of us said that those conversations aren't happening at home, right? So for me, when I'm talking to my students at Lackawanna College, they don't believe, they have lots of limiting beliefs. No one ever talked to them about finance, and so they don't believe that building personal wealth is in the cards for them. They have no idea that there's a plan to do it, and they don't know what compound interest is, let alone what a budget looks like. So I think for us, we intervene at Lackawanna College often as mentors in the classroom, and I know that, Mike, you did a lot of that with our football students. I heard a lot of awesome impact that you had in that classroom, and I can't underestimate what the impact to our communities would be if we started having more personal finance conversations earlier and more often, and not just in the educational system. If we started empowering families to talk about it, if we involved government, right, cities, businesses, education, if we all collaborated together, the impact and the transformation in our community would be astounding. Personal finance impacts everything. Food insecurity could be solved or resolved. Rates of crimes could be improved. Our neighborhoods would get better, right? Foreclosure rates would go down. Think about relationships Scott's talking about with family. There's top 4 reasons people get divorced, and finance is number 1. Right? Relationships. Scott was telling us before that a client was bringing up a family feud from Christmas 1955.
1955.
Right? The impact of teaching personal finance could be transformational in the lives of people in our community, and could transform our entire community, the community that we all love and are a part of.
So, Chris, we'll go to you so Steph doesn't have to comment on her own.
Thank you.
Her own take, but I think it really does sum it together in such a beautiful way, where you're talking about these societal, foundational issues, particularly in northeastern Pennsylvania, that can be addressed. I don't want to say easily, but they can be improved probably fairly easily if you're able to kind of stitch together something at scale. So these conversations are brought out of the the bedroom, and they're had at the kitchen table.
Yeah, I think you said it. There's just an alignment from Alliance, alignment with Lackawanna, alignment with the community to address these issues. And I think, like we talked about, seeing this idea that we have with some of these coffee conversations, or huddling up at the innovation conference, and seeing this come to life, and kicking this off and starting these conversations, and I think you summarize the impact very well. And it's going to take some time. It's something that the 3 of us can't do this alone. So part of this conversation is to bring awareness and to bring this to the community, because this is my hometown. I went to college, came back. I worked in downtown Scranton, for almost, 18 years. I moved 3 blocks, all in the same area. And it's just something where, I think there should be a level of pride. And I think a level as a business in the region, and as a community college in the region, we have a responsibility to help drive financial outcomes for more people in the region. And I think that's a great way to summarize it at the end, and really try to grow this and to increase more participation to help address those issues.
And I think the one thing I found that night, in experimenting with this idea in many different ways, but what I found out that night is people want this. People want to have this conversation. And it was amazing because the age, what they did for a living, how well I knew them even was irrelevant. When people sat and listened to that night, it did make an impact. And there was a reason we used that word, right? Because you don't know how much this could change things. And so I'd like to close out quickly, Steph, with a question, and I'll ask it to both of you because I've asked it to every guest so far. I'll start with you. What advice or feedback would you give your 22-year-old self, knowing all you know now? And I think, this question really fits in here today, maybe more than it did in other episodes.
Chris, did you know this was the question?
I knew how this is how we ended, but I didn't prepare for it.
Okay. All right. You're off the hook then. What piece of advice. I think I would tell my 20-year-old self, yes, Eddie's the right one, marry him. Because I think in finance, a lot of who you end up with has a lot to do with.
It certainly does.
So I certainly would say that. But I think I would just tell myself to constantly surround myself with people that are smarter than me. I had this fear as a young manager and leader that I had to be the smartest one at the table and that I couldn't make mistakes. And I think I cost myself a lot of lessons and paid a lot of stupid tax if I would have just, surrounded myself with people that were smarter and would sharpen me more. So
that is such a good answer.
I think for me, it's, just because you get it right the first time doesn't mean it's going to be right forever. So constantly you're rethinking and just looking at different initiatives or different views that you have in your life and making sure that they fit with you, right? And who you are today and after you go through a lot of those experiences. And I also think we talk about, money all the time. We're talking about personal finance. But as you go through, and we have an opportunity to work with, the wealth builder, the retirement and that person that's selling the business, and you see almost a sneak peek of your life, right? And, for me, working in this industry has shown me that priorities have changed, and it's not always about money, right? So don't put that pressure on just building that up and just constantly judging yourself on, your portfolio. It's about your friends, right? And it's about who you surround yourself with, and your family, right? So having that balanced approach, and we have that luxury of seeing that with a lot of our clients, is something to always keep in the back of your head.
I love that. Well, thank you both for being here today. We're excited to keep this conversation going. We're excited to build on this. Our Center for Investor Education is to bring these conversations, as Stephanie Decker said, both to the classroom and the kitchen table. So thank you both for being here and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks. Thank you.
The information on this podcast was created by Alliance Wealth Advisors and published for informational purposes only. The guest on this episode was not a client at the time of this interview and did not receive any compensation. For more information, please visit alliancewealthadvisors.com.